So one of the great blessings that came out of our small group ministry most recently was one night, 11 people who either facilitate or lead a small group or a group that operates much like a small group, sat around our living room at home and shared one by one some of the blessings that their small group has been experiencing this past year. And I was overwhelmed, especially by the depth of friendship and pastoral care that happens in those small groups. It was an incredible blessing to be there and to hear the stories that were being shared. I have been equally blessed to have been a part of the Ignite small group that met on Tuesday nights during the winter. The members of that small group were a constant encouragement to me, and I learned so much from them. I remember in particular one night when we were talking about why we believe in God, and someone in the small group opened my eyes to a miracle that I had never recognized before. He said, "Think about seeds. They're all about the same size. You gardeners will appreciate this. They're all about the same size, and they look very much alike. But consider the vast diversity that comes out of them when they're planted. Only God could do that. Only God could do that." That is, my friends, an excellent definition of a miracle. The Oxford Dictionary says that a miracle is an extraordinary event attributed to some supernatural agency, which is really just another way of saying a miracle is something that only God can do. I've entitled this morning's message, Miracles at First. And if you caught the title prior to coming, you may have come in expecting me to be speaking about the daycare by that name that operates out of our church facility. But I'm not going to be talking about the daycare, at least not in any direct way. Instead, I want us to look at the account of a miracle recorded for us in the book of John, chapter 6, verses 1 to 14. It's the miracle that Brooke read for us. It's the miracle of Jesus feeding a crowd of at least 5,000 people with just 2 small fish and 5 small loaves of barley bread. I'd like for us to look at this miracle and learn 3 lessons that can help pave the way for modern day miracles in and through our church. And the lessons are: miracles fit God's purposes, miracles surpass logical expectations, and miracles follow obedience. First, I'd like to make just a general comment on the account of the miracle in John 6, 1 to 14. Interestingly enough, this is the only miracle apart from the resurrection that is recorded in all 4 of the gospel books of the Bible. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they all write about it. And we've actually put the specific references for you here, just at the start of the sermon notes in your bulletin, so that later today you can go home and make a cup of tea or coffee, whatever it is, your favorite beverage. Sit down with your beverage and your Bible and read through those 4 different accounts. I think you'll find it fascinating. You'll notice that the 4 writers feature different details, and that may be because they actually saw different details as the event was unfolding. It may be because each writer was intrigued by different parts of what was happening. So I'll be referring to John chapter 6, verses 1 to 14 as our main text for the message this morning, but many details will be coming from the other gospel accounts. The first lesson we can learn from the miracle of Jesus feeding the 5,000 is that miracles fit God's purposes. In John 6 and verses 2 to 3, we read that a great crowd of people followed Jesus because they saw the miraculous signs he had performed on the sick. And so then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. We learn from the other gospel writers that Jesus and his disciples went off to this remote place because so many people were coming and going that they didn't even have a chance to eat. We learn too that in addition to being exhausted, Jesus and his disciples were grieving. They had just received word that Herod had killed Jesus' cousin, John the Baptist. And so Jesus said to his disciples, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." I love the way Jesus validates our need to slip away and rest with his own example. But even though Jesus legitimizes self-care in this incident, he also shows us that there may be times when we will need to set aside what we consider to be our own best interests because of our concern for others. Mark tells us that when Jesus saw the large crowd that had followed him to the remote place, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And Luke tells us that Jesus welcomed the crowds of people and spoke to them about the kingdom of God and healed those who needed healing. You know, Jesus could have ignored the crowds and their needs. And certainly there were other times when Jesus did slip away by himself for rest and renewal. But this time he allowed his retreat to be interrupted. His compassion overcame his own interests, and he chose to fit into God's plans and purposes for the crowds. Jesus showed that miracles must fit in with God's purposes and only with God's purposes when Satan was tempting him in the wilderness. During those temptations, Jesus clearly refused to perform any miracles that would have promoted his own interest. He wouldn't turn the stones into bread, even though he was hungry. He wouldn't throw himself down from the temple spires so angels could rescue him and champion his divinity. No, every miracle that Jesus performed was clothed with compassion and fit into God's redemptive purposes for the world. Similarly, if we are to experience miracles at first, our lives and our ministries must fit God's purposes. How can we know the purposes of God? Sometimes they seem so mysterious. For example, why does God heal one person but not another? And why does God answer some prayers with an amazing yes, and yet say not yet to other prayers, and even answer some prayers with a definite no? Many of God's purposes will remain hidden to us in this world, but God has already revealed to us his redemptive purposes for the world. He's revealed them in the scriptures. And God's will has never changed. It's still his heart's desire that we should love him most, and then love and care for one another, and then reach out with compassion to those who do not yet know him. Furthermore, God has promised to reveal his purposes for our lives as individuals and for our church as we pray and look to him for guidance. God doesn't want us to miss his specific plans for our lives and for our ministries. We know from our anniversary review of our church's history that God has already performed many miracles at first. How could a church rise up after a devastating fire and thrive even while they were losing an entire generation to the war. How could this happen except that God was at work doing what only God can do? If we want to experience more miracles at first, we will have to continue to discover His purposes for us and be willing to fit into these, even if it means surrendering what we most want for ourselves. The second lesson we can learn about miracles from the account of Jesus feeding the 5,000 is that miracles always surpass logical expectations. Late in the day, when mealtime had come and gone, and the people still hadn't had anything to eat, a collection of the disciples came to Jesus and they said, "This is a remote place, and it's already very late. Send the people away so they can go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." That sounds reasonable, doesn't it? It sounds reasonable, it sounds caring. The disciples must have been really taken aback when, instead of agreeing with this reasonable thought, Jesus said to them, "You give them something to eat." With that command, Jesus began to usher the disciples past their logical expectations and into the realm of miracles, into the realm of God doing what only God can do. Because you see, the disciples had no food to give. They couldn't buy any, they couldn't even scrounge up food from the crowds. It's as though Jesus wanted them to know that they were logically stuck. He wanted them to know that they needed a miracle. Commentators suggest that Jesus singled out Philip and pressed him about buying food to feed the crowds because Philip came from the nearest little village called Bethsaida, and he knew better than any of the other disciples that what Jesus was proposing just wasn't reasonable. Sure enough, Philip's response to Jesus was, 8 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of these people to have even just a bite. In other words, even if there was enough food in these here hills to feed the people, we could never afford to buy enough to feed this huge crowd. Jesus had the other disciples search the crowd for food. Now, it might be easy to think that he did this because he was hoping to find food, but have you ever thought that maybe he had the disciples search because he wanted to prove that there wasn't enough food to be found? And sure enough, after combing the crowds, all the food the disciples could come up with was one little boy's lunch of 2 small fish and 5 small loaves of barley bread. Now, the fish would have been pickled, and they would have been about the size of a sardine or a Newfoundland capelin. And the bread would have been 5 small rolls, and they would have been made of barley and not wheat, because barley was a food staple for the poor. And it's thought that this little boy actually joined the crowd later on in the day, perhaps after he had been sent out from a nearby village with his lunch to play, because otherwise his food, like all the rest, would have been long gone. And so it was that when Jesus was satisfied that his disciples knew there was no logical way that they could feed the crowd, that Jesus performed the miracle. He wanted it to be clear that the people were fed only because God did what only God can do. He wanted God to be revealed. He wanted God to get the credit. He wanted people to believe in a God who will not be limited by logical conclusions. Miracles will always surpass logical and reasonable expectations. Was it reasonable to suppose that Jesus would walk on top of the water? Was it reasonable to suppose that Lazarus would be raised from the dead? Was it reasonable to suppose that Jesus would be? Yet, we are guilty of so often relying only on our own limited understanding instead of fully trusting God. I wonder how many times do we miss out on exciting opportunities for ministry and mission and send the people away to fend for themselves because we aren't willing to trust God to do what seems to us to be impossible. Proverbs 3:5 and says that we're to trust God with all our hearts and not lean on our own understanding. Because you see, miracles will always surpass logical expectations. The third lesson we can learn about miracles from this passage in John is that miracles are experienced by those who choose to obey God. Miracles follow obedience. Approximately 10,000 people witnessed or saw this particular miracle that day, and we know this because Jewish custom was to count only the men. So if all the women and children had been included in the count, the number would easily have been doubled. So many people saw the miracle that day, but the disciples got to be a part of it. Jesus actually drew them right on to the very edges of the miracle. They got to talk the situation over with Jesus. And then he brought them to the end of themselves, and he brought them to the end of their logic so that they could recognize the source and substance of the miracle. And then Jesus gave them instructions to obey. Small steps, just one step at a time. Feed the people. Search the crowd to see if there's any food. Bring me the little boy's lunch. Have the people sit down in groups of 50 and 100. I love Jesus' organized approach to ministry. And then Jesus followed Jewish custom and he thanked God for the food. And then he performed the miracle. God did what only God could do. He turned 2 small fish and 5 small loaves of barley bread into enough food to feed over 10,000 people so that everybody was full and still there were leftovers. And then Jesus engaged his disciples in the fallout from the miracle. He said, pass it around until everybody has had enough, and then go get your traveling baskets. There'll be 12 of them. And use your baskets to collect all the leftovers so nothing will be wasted. God is, of course, perfectly able to perform miracles without any help from us. But isn't it generous of him to bring his followers onto the edges of the miracles that he's performing so that as we go about obeying him, we can be blessed in extra special ways? God often gives us tiny roles and small tasks just so he can make miracles a blessing in our lives. But in order for us to be so blessed, we must be willing to obey God with the small steps he wants us to take. That's what it was like for me the night that God performed the miracle in, I'm going to call him Tom, in Tom's life. It was very late one night when one of my friends called, very anxious and afraid for her husband. Her husband had lost his job that day, and he was really overwhelmed by the stress of it. Now, you might think that it would be easy for me to just leave and go to be with them, but I have to tell you, I really, really struggled to obey. It was very late into the night, I was very tired, and I was very reluctant to give up the comfort of my own home. But even more than all of that, I didn't want to go because I felt completely inadequate to help them. I thought, I don't know what to say, I don't know what to do. I really felt that I was in way over my head. And so I just began to pray until eventually I had given the whole situation over to God. And when I got in the car to drive to their house, I was depending totally on God because I didn't know what else to do. So when I got there, I sat with them and I listened to the husband pour out his fear and his pain and his confusion. I still didn't know what to do, and I didn't know what to say. I just kept asking God to help us. And then I decided to say what I sensed God prompting me to say, but I said it with a lot of fear and trembling, fully expecting to be rebuffed. I said, Tom, you need God's help with your life. And then you could have knocked me over with a feather, because Tom stopped and he thought for a moment. Then he looked at me and he said with absolute conviction, you're right. I really do. How do I get that? Well, I began to piece together the points of the gospel for him, overwhelming both of us by times with far too much information, and thinking even while I was talking, this really shouldn't be this clumsy for somebody who's trained in ministry. When I finished, I said to him, Tom, do you understand? And he said, yes, I do. And so then we sat for a few minutes while I debated what to do next. And finally, I realized that there was no way to go except forward. So with a lot of trepidation, I said, Tom, would you like to turn your life over to Jesus? And he said, yes. Oh, yes. And I said incredulously, you would? And he said again, yes. Oh, yes. And so I led Tom in a prayer in which he very sincerely asked for God's forgiveness, and then invited Jesus into his life and asked Jesus to be in charge of it. And then I saw Tom relax into an astounding peace. When I got home that night, I couldn't sleep. I was absolutely overcome with joy and with wonder. I knew that I had just witnessed a miracle, and I was stunned by it. I saw clearly that it was a miracle because it had absolutely nothing to do with me and everything to do with God. And so it is, my friends, that as we obediently step out into the challenges that are too big for us, fully relying on God because we know that we are in over our heads, that we will see God do in us and around us and in spite of us things that only God can do. Miracles fit God's purposes. They surpass logical expectations, and they follow obedience. If we are to continue to experience miracles at first, we must make God and his purposes the center of everything we are and do. We must humble ourselves and learn greater ways of depending on him. And we must be willing to step out in obedience to do whatever it is that God shows us to do. And in order to respond in all of these ways, we absolutely must be fervent in prayer. Pastor Richard is going to come and lead us in prayer now. We did agree on this. If you would like to join me in praying for miracles at first on an ongoing basis, I would just love to hear from you. I would welcome it if you would speak to me after the service, if you want to call me this week or send me an email. There will be power in our combined prayers, we will be an encouragement to one another, and together we will celebrate many miracles at first.